The gun trembled in Aileen Wuornos' hand as she stood over the body of Richard Mallory, her chest heaving with a mixture of terror and rage. Blood pooled beneath him on the forest floor, and in that moment, on December 1st, 1989, America's most notorious female serial killer was born. But what drove a woman to become what the media would eventually call the Damsel of Death? What series of devastating events could transform a human being into a monster capable of killing 7 men in cold blood? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in a lifetime of unimaginable suffering that began long before that fateful night in the Florida woods. Aileen Carol Pittman entered this world on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, already destined for hardship. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a psychopathic child molester who would later hang himself in prison. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was just 16 years old and completely unprepared for motherhood. Before Aileen even reached her first birthday, her father was gone, and her mother had abandoned both Aileen and her older brother Keith, leaving them on the doorstep of their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. But this wasn't a rescue. This was a descent into hell. Lori Wuornos was a violent alcoholic whose rage knew no bounds. Young Aileen learned quickly that home was not a place of safety, but a battlefield where survival meant enduring daily beatings with belts, extension cords, and anything else her grandfather could get his hands on. The abuse was so severe that neighbors would later recall hearing the children's screams echoing through the quiet suburban streets. What could drive a man to torture innocent children? What darkness lived inside Lori Wuornos that he felt compelled to brutalize a little girl who had already lost everything? The psychological torture was equally devastating. Lori and Britta never told Aileen and Keith that they were their grandparents. The children grew up believing their grandparents were their parents and their real mother was their older sister. Can you imagine discovering that your entire life has been built on a lie? That the people you called mother and father were actually the ones who had enabled your own mother to abandon you? By the age of 11, Aileen was already engaging in sexual acts with boys in the neighborhood, trading her body for cigarettes, drugs, and the smallest scraps of affection. But this wasn't rebellion or promiscuity in any conventional sense. This was a traumatized child desperately seeking something, anything that felt like love or acceptance. The boys in her neighborhood knew they could exploit her vulnerability, and they did, repeatedly, callously. Then came an even darker violation. Aileen would later claim that Lori sexually abused her during these years, though the full extent of this abuse remains shrouded in the conflicting testimonies and suppressed memories of a shattered childhood. What we know for certain is that by age 14, Aileen was pregnant. The father was either a family friend or, according to some accounts, her own brother, Keith. The truth of her child's paternity remains one of many horrifying uncertainties in her story. On March 23, 1971, Aileen gave birth to a baby boy. She was 14 years old, still a child herself, forced to carry a pregnancy that resulted from either incest or statutory rape. The baby was immediately taken from her and put up for adoption. Did she want to keep him? Did anyone ask? Did anyone care about what this young girl might need or feel? The system that should have protected her instead stripped away the one thing that might have given her life meaning. Just months later, in July 1971, her grandmother Britta died of liver failure, likely accelerated by years of alcoholism and living with Lori's violence. With Britta gone, Lori's rage intensified. He kicked both Aileen and Keith out of the house. Aileen was 15 years old, pregnant and suddenly homeless. She had no education, no job skills, no support system, and nowhere to turn. The streets became her home, and survival became her only goal. Aileen began working as a prostitute, selling her body to truck drivers and Johns at highway rest stops along Florida's Interstate 75. She was still just a teenager. What thoughts went through her mind during those early days on the street? Did she dream of escape? Did she imagine a different life was still possible? Or had the cumulative weight of abuse, abandonment, and betrayal already convinced her that this was all she deserved? In May 1974, Aileen was arrested for drunk driving, disorderly conduct, and firing a pistol from a moving vehicle. She was 18 years old and already building a criminal record that would span decades. The arrests kept coming: forgery, robbery, assault. She bounced between Florida and Michigan, leaving a trail of petty crimes and failed relationships in her wake. Then, in 1976, she hitchhiked to Florida and married 69-year-old Louis Gratz-Fell, the president of a yacht club. She was 20 years old. He was nearly 50 years older. Was this finally her chance at stability, at respectability, at a life that didn't involve selling her body to strangers? For a brief moment it seemed possible. Their wedding announcement even appeared in the society pages of the local newspaper, presenting Aileen as a respectable young bride. But the marriage lasted only 9 weeks. Aileen's violent temper, shaped by years of abuse and survival on the streets, erupted repeatedly. She beat Louis with his own cane during arguments. The violence that had been inflicted upon her throughout her childhood was now manifesting in her own relationships. Louis obtained a restraining order, and the marriage was annulled. Another door slammed shut. Another possibility of a different life vanished. In July 1976, her brother Keith died of throat cancer at just 21 years old. Despite everything, Keith had been one of the few constants in Aileen's chaotic life, someone who understood where she came from and what she had survived. His death devastated her. She received $10,000 from his life insurance policy, but within months, she had spent it all, squandering her last financial safety net on alcohol and reckless living. Throughout the late 70s and 80s, Aileen's life became a repetitive cycle of prostitution, petty crime, and jail time. She was arrested again and again for assault, passing bad checks, car theft, and armed robbery. In 1981, she robbed a convenience store in Edgewater, Florida, while dressed in a bikini. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison but was released after serving just 18 months. What happens to a person's psyche after decades of this existence? After being used, discarded, beaten, arrested, imprisoned, and released, only to repeat the cycle again? The human mind can only endure so much before something fundamental breaks. In 1986, at a gay bar in Daytona Beach called the Zodiac, Aileen met Tyria Moore. Their connection was immediate and intense. Tyria, who went by Ty, was 24 years old, a hotel maid from Ohio who had come to Florida seeking a fresh start. For Aileen, Ty represented something she had craved her entire life: genuine love and companionship. "I've never felt this way about anyone," Aileen told Ty during their early days together, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You're the only person who's ever really seen me." Ty moved in with Aileen almost immediately, and they began a tumultuous relationship that would last 4 years. For the first time in her adult life, Aileen felt she had found someone worth living for, someone who accepted her despite her past. But their relationship existed in a desperate economic reality. Aileen continued working as a prostitute to support both of them, walking the highways at night, getting into cars with strange men, risking her life repeatedly to earn enough money for rent, food, and beer. Ty knew what Aileen did for money. She benefited from it. But did she understand the toll it was taking? Did she recognize the danger Aileen faced every single night? By 1989, Aileen was 33 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades selling her body on Florida's highways. She was tired, angry, and increasingly volatile. The accumulated trauma of her entire life was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of Richard Mallory. On November 30th, 1989, Aileen was hitchhiking along Interstate 75 when 51-year-old Richard Mallory picked her up. Mallory owned an electronics repair shop in Clearwater and had a secret life that included heavy drinking and frequenting prostitutes. What happened next in that car would be disputed for years to come. According to Aileen's testimony, Mallory drove her to a remote area in the woods. He gave her money for sex. But then the situation turned violent. "He told me to do things I didn't want to do," Aileen would later claim. "He tied me up. He raped me. He beat me. I thought he was going to kill me." Whether this account was true or a fabrication designed to justify murder, we may never know with certainty. What we do know is that Aileen had a .22 caliber pistol with her that night, and she used it. She shot Richard Mallory multiple times, killing him. Then she took his money, his car, and his belongings, and she drove away, leaving his body in the woods. When Aileen returned to the motel room she shared with Ty, she was shaking, covered in scratches and bruises. "What happened to you?" Ty asked, alarm spreading across her face. "I had to do it," Aileen said, her voice eerily calm despite her trembling hands. "He was going to kill me. I didn't have a choice." Ty stared at her. "Do what? What are you talking about?" "I killed him," Aileen whispered. "I killed a man." The room fell silent except for the hum of the cheap motel air conditioner. Ty's face went pale, but she didn't call the police. She didn't leave. Instead, she stayed with Aileen, and together they began using Richard Mallory's stolen possessions and credit cards. Was Ty complicit in what came next? Did her silence make her an accessory to not just one murder but 6 more? Because Aileen didn't stop with Richard Mallory. Something had broken inside her that night, or perhaps something that had been broken for years, finally shattered completely. Within the next 12 months, 6 more men would die along Florida's highways. On June 1st, 1990, 43-year-old David Spears, a heavy equipment operator, picked up Aileen while hitchhiking. His naked body was found 6 days later in a wooded area in Citrus County, shot 6 times with a .22 caliber weapon. His truck was missing. On June 6th, just 5 days after David Spears' murder, 40-year-old Charles Carskadden, a part-time rodeo worker, made the fatal mistake of offering Aileen a ride. His body was discovered on June 13th along Route 52 in Pasco County, shot 9 times. His belongings had been stolen. On July 4th, Independence Day, 65-year-old Peter Seams, a retired merchant seaman and part-time missionary, vanished after leaving his home in Jupiter, Florida. His body was never found, but his car was discovered on July 4th in Orange Springs, Florida, crashed and abandoned. Witnesses reported seeing 2 women fleeing the vehicle, one blonde and one brunette, arguing loudly as they left the scene. Police sketches of the 2 women began circulating, but investigators didn't yet know they were looking for serial killers. On August 4th, 50-year-old Troy Burris, a sausage salesman and father of 2, disappeared while on his delivery route. His body was discovered on August 8th in a wooded area in Marion County, shot twice with a .22 caliber weapon. His truck and wallet were missing. On September 11th, 56-year-old Charles Dick Humphreys, a retired Air Force major, child abuse investigator, and married father of 6, picked up Aileen while she was hitchhiking. His fully clothed body was found on September 12th in Marion County, shot 7 times. His car was stolen and later found crashed. On November 19th, 60-year-old Walter Gino Antonio, a police reserve officer, security guard, and truck driver, became Aileen's final victim. His nearly naked body was discovered on November 24th in a remote area northwest of Cross City, shot 4 times in the back and head. His car was stolen. 7 men dead in just 12 months, 7 families destroyed. But what was going through Aileen's mind during this killing spree? Was each murder self-defense, as she would later claim? Or had she discovered something dark and powerful in that first killing, a way to take back control, to punish the men who had used her body for decades? The pattern was unmistakable. Middle-aged men traveling alone on Florida's highways, shot multiple times with the same .22 caliber weapon, their belongings stolen. Florida law enforcement finally connected the murders and realized they were hunting a serial killer, but they had no idea the killer was a woman. Serial killers were almost always men. How could they have anticipated that a female prostitute was responsible for this carnage? Meanwhile, Aileen and Ty were living in cheap motels, moving frequently, using the victims' stolen credit cards and selling their belongings. The money from the murders allowed them to drink heavily, stay in slightly better accommodations, and avoid the constant pressure of Aileen having to work the streets every night. In a twisted way, murder had improved their financial situation, but their relationship was deteriorating rapidly. Ty was terrified, drinking more heavily and becoming increasingly withdrawn. She knew what Aileen was doing. She had to know. The evidence was everywhere. The stolen cars, the belongings from murdered men, the news reports about bodies being found along the highways they frequented. "Why do you keep doing this?" Ty reportedly asked during one of their arguments. "This has to stop." "I'm doing this for us," Aileen shouted back. "Everything I do is for us. Those men, they deserved it. They were all going to hurt me. I'm protecting myself." "From what?" Ty asked, tears streaming down her face. "You're the one killing people." Their arguments became more frequent and more violent. By late 1990, their relationship was hanging by a thread. Then, in January 1991, the net finally closed around them. On January 9th, 1991, police arrested Aileen at the Last Resort, a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida, on an outstanding warrant for a weapons violation. They didn't initially suspect her of the murders, but they were building their case. Meanwhile, investigators convinced Ty to cooperate with them. They knew about her relationship with Aileen, they had the witness descriptions from the Peter Seams car crash, and they believed Ty could be the key to getting a confession. Over the next few days, with police monitoring and recording the calls, Ty phoned Aileen repeatedly at the jail where she was being held. The conversations were heartbreaking and chilling in equal measure. "Lee, you need to tell them the truth," Ty said during one call, her voice carefully coached by the detectives standing beside her. "Tell them what really happened. I can't handle this anymore." "I love you, Ty," Aileen said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Everything I did for us. You know that, right? You have to know that." "Then tell them," Ty insisted. "Tell them everything. Just tell them the truth." "Will you wait for me?" Aileen asked, the desperation clear in her voice. "If I tell them everything, will you still be there when I get out?" There was a long pause on the line. The detectives gestured frantically for Ty to answer. "Yes," Ty finally said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I'll be here." It was a lie, and perhaps Aileen knew it even then. But she wanted to believe it so desperately that she allowed herself to be deceived one final time. On January 16th, 1991, Aileen Wuornos confessed to killing 6 men. She insisted that each killing was in self-defense, that each man had either raped her, tried to rape her, or threatened to kill her. She claimed she was a victim fighting back against men who sought to victimize her. "I'm not a man-hater," she told investigators, chain-smoking throughout the interrogation. "I'm not some serial killer. I was defending myself. Every single time I was defending myself against men who wanted to hurt me." But the evidence suggested a different story. The victims were shot multiple times, often from behind. Their belongings were stolen. There was no physical evidence of sexual assault. And most damning of all, the pattern suggested premeditation. Aileen had been armed. She had targeted vulnerable men, and she had robbed them after killing them. The media descended on the story like locusts. A female serial killer was unprecedented, shocking, and endlessly fascinating. The press dubbed her the Damsel of Death, the hooker from hell, and America's first female serial killer. Overnight, Aileen Wuornos became infamous. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began on January 14th, 1992. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered for money. They presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Aileen's own inconsistent statements. The defense tried to argue self-defense and introduce evidence of Aileen's horrific childhood, claiming that years of abuse had left her with severe mental health issues that affected her judgment and impulse control. But the jury wasn't buying it. On January 27, 1992, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, they found Aileen Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder. The penalty phase began immediately. Aileen took the stand in her own defense during the penalty phase, and what happened next would shock everyone in the courtroom. Instead of showing remorse or pleading for mercy, Aileen exploded with rage. "I killed those men in self-defense," she shouted at the jury, her face contorted with anger. "I was raped, I was brutalized, and I fought back. I'd kill every one of them again if I had to. I'm not sorry." You're going to convict me anyway because I'm a woman and because I'm poor and because nobody gives a damn about what happened to me." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Aileen's attorneys tried desperately to calm her down, but she was beyond reason, beyond strategy. This was decades of rage and pain finally finding its voice. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before recommending death. On January 31st, 1992, Judge Uriel Blount sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death by electrocution. She was convicted of killing Richard Mallory and sentenced to die. Over the next year, Aileen pleaded no contest to 5 additional murders. She was sentenced to death 5 more times. In total, she received 6 death sentences. The state of Florida had made its decision. Aileen Wuornos would die for her crimes. But the story didn't end there. For the next 12 years, Aileen sat on death row at the Broward Correctional Institution, filing appeals, giving interviews, and slowly descending into what appeared to be severe mental illness, or possibly a calculated performance of insanity. Ty Moore was never charged with any crime. She testified against Aileen at trial and then disappeared from public life, changing her name and moving away. She never visited Aileen on death row. Their love story, which had ended in betrayal and blood, was over. In prison, Aileen became increasingly erratic and paranoid. She gave interviews to documentarian Nick Broomfield, who made 2 films about her case. In these interviews, she displayed wild mood swings, going from calm and articulate to screaming and paranoid within minutes. "They're putting drugs in my food," she told Broomfield during one interview, her eyes darting around the room. "The police, the corrections officers, they're all in on it. They're trying to drive me insane so they can execute me faster." She also recanted her self-defense claims, then recanted the recantation, then changed her story again. In her final interviews, she claimed that all the killings were premeditated murders for money, not self-defense. Was this the truth finally emerging, or was it a desperate woman trying to speed up her own execution because she couldn't endure another day in prison? Mental health experts who examined Aileen disagreed about her psychological state. Some believed she suffered from borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from her childhood abuse. Others believed she was exaggerating symptoms to support an insanity defense or to draw sympathy. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, a deeply damaged woman whose mental health had deteriorated even further under the stress of death row. In 2001, Aileen fired her lawyers and demanded that her execution be carried out. She claimed she wanted to be with Jesus, and that continuing to live was unbearable torture. The courts granted her request, and her execution was scheduled. On October 9, 2002, the morning of her execution, Aileen gave her final interview. She was calm, almost serene, and she spoke directly to the camera. "I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back," she said cryptically. "I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Later that morning, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her last meal was a cup of coffee. She refused a final statement. At 9:47 a.m., she was pronounced dead at the age of 46. Her last words before the chemicals entered her veins were reportedly, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." But what legacy did Aileen Wuornos leave behind? What are we to make of her life and crimes? Her story raises uncomfortable questions about justice, abuse, mental health, and the death penalty that remain unresolved to this day. After her death, new evidence emerged about Richard Mallory, Aileen's first victim. Investigators discovered that Mallory had served 10 years in prison for violent rape and had a documented history of violence against women. This information was not presented at Aileen's trial. Would the jury's decision have been different if they had known that her first victim was a convicted violent rapist? Does that change our understanding of what happened that night in 1989? Advocates argued that Aileen Wuornos was failed by every system that should have protected her. A girl born into an abusive home, raped as a child, forced into pregnancy at 14, thrown onto the streets as a teenager where she had to sell her body to survive. Where were the child protective services? Where were the social workers, the teachers, the community members who should have intervened? How many chances did society have to save Aileen Wuornos before she became a killer? But victims' advocates pointed to 7 dead men, 7 destroyed families, and argued that childhood trauma, no matter how severe, does not excuse murder. They argued that many people endure horrible childhoods without becoming serial killers, and that accepting abuse as an excuse for violence sets a dangerous precedent. The debate over Aileen Wuornos continues decades after her death. She has been the subject of countless documentaries, books, articles, and even a major Hollywood film, Monster, starring Charlize Theron, who won an Academy Award for her portrayal of Aileen. The film presented a sympathetic view of Aileen as a damaged woman driven to murder by a lifetime of abuse and exploitation. So, what is the truth about Aileen Wuornos? Was she a victim who fought back against her abusers? Was she a cold-blooded killer who murdered for money and then crafted a false narrative of self-defense? Or was she something more complicated? A deeply traumatized, mentally ill woman whose capacity for empathy and moral reasoning had been destroyed by decades of abuse, abandonment, and survival on society's margins. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Aileen Wuornos was all of these things simultaneously. She was a victim of terrible abuse who became a perpetrator of terrible violence. She was a woman failed by every institution that encountered her, who then failed humanity by taking innocent lives. She was the product of a broken system that criminalizes poverty, ignores child abuse, and offers no real path to recovery for the deeply traumatized. The uncomfortable truth that Aileen Wuornos forces us to confront is that monsters are made, not born. Every serial killer has an origin story, and those stories almost always include horrific abuse, neglect, and trauma in childhood. This doesn't excuse their crimes, but it does challenge us to ask harder questions about how we structure our society and how we respond to vulnerable children. If someone had intervened when Aileen was being beaten by her grandfather, would Richard Mallory still be alive? If someone had protected her from sexual abuse, would David Spears have lived? If someone had prevented her from being thrown onto the streets at 15 years old, would 6 other men have survived to grow old with their families? We can never know the answers to these questions, but we must ask them anyway. Aileen Wuornos died over 2 decades ago, but her story remains relevant because the systems that failed her continue to fail vulnerable children today. Across America right now, there are children being abused, neglected, and exploited. There are teenagers being forced into prostitution to survive. There are deeply traumatized people receiving no mental health care, no support, no pathway to healing. Some of them will become tomorrow's victims, and some will become tomorrow's monsters. The tragedy of Aileen Wuornos is not just that she killed 7 men, though that is certainly tragic. The deeper tragedy is that her entire life, from birth to execution, represents a cascading series of failures by every adult and institution that should have protected her. She fell through every crack in our social safety net and landed in the worst possible place, on death row, having taken multiple lives, hated by millions, and ultimately killed by the state. In the end, what shocked the world about Aileen Wuornos wasn't just that she was a female serial killer, though that was certainly unprecedented. What truly shocked us was being forced to confront the uncomfortable connection between victimization and violence, between the abuse we ignore and the crimes we condemn. Aileen Wuornos held up a mirror to society's worst failures, and we didn't like what we saw reflected back. Her story is a cautionary tale about what happens when we abandon our most vulnerable members, when we allow child abuse to continue unchecked, when we criminalize poverty and mental illness instead of addressing them, and when we offer no path to redemption or recovery for the traumatized. These are systemic failures that continue today, creating new victims and new perpetrators in an endless cycle of violence. If this story has captivated you, if it's made you think differently about crime, punishment, and justice, then hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. This is exactly the kind of deep dive into true crime that we bring you regularly, examining not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means for all of us. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story, and give this video a like if you found it compelling. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people who need to hear them. The execution of Aileen Wuornos closed the final chapter of her life, but it didn't answer the fundamental questions her case raises. As a society, we must decide, do we want to keep creating more Aileen Wuornoses by failing vulnerable children, or do we want to intervene early enough to prevent both victimization and future violence? The choice is ours, and children are waiting for our answer right now, in abusive homes, in foster care, on the streets, hoping someone will care enough to save them before it's too late. Aileen Wuornos was executed, but the systems that created her remain fully operational, producing new tragedies every single day. Until we address the root causes of violence, until we protect our most vulnerable members, until we offer real pathways to healing for the traumatized, we will keep creating monsters and then expressing shock when they emerge from the shadows to commit terrible crimes. That is the true story that shocked the world, and it continues to unfold today in cities and towns across America. The question is, what are we going to do about it?